Hi everyone, it's Dr. Fox, and let's talk about the muscles of ventilation. In this video, we'll discuss ventilation versus respiration, the movement of gases, and how volume influences pressure, i.e. Boyle's law. We'll also describe the diaphragm, its relationships to thoracic and abdominal cavities, its shape, innervation, and how it drives ventilation. Finally, we'll discuss some of the accessory muscles of ventilation and how they influence either forceful inhalation or exhalation. So let's start with the concept of ventilation. Ventilation is the process of moving air into and out of the lungs. It's also the process of moving air into and out of the alveoli. And we would specifically refer to this as alveolar ventilation. Now, the movement of air or gases is going to behave in accordance with Boyle's law. Boyle's law, simply stated, is that pressure is inversely proportional to volume. What that means is that with the same amount of gas, at a greater volume, we'll have lower pressure. With lesser volume, we have greater pressure. And you can see here that these gas molecules in a greater volume have more amount of room to space out. Now, gas is very lazy. It's always going to move from higher to lower pressure. So it will always move from lesser volumes to greater volumes of spaces. Now, to understand the process of ventilation, we'll have to break this down into the processes of inhalation, or bringing air into the lungs and the alveoli, versus exhalation, moving air out of the alveoli and the lungs. Ventilation is something that we need to contrast with that of respiration. Oftentimes, these concepts are confounded. Respiration is when we have gases cross membranes. So within the body, we have external respiration. With external respiration, that's the movement of gases such as carbon dioxide, oxygen, amongst others, across the walls of the alveoli. There's also internal respiration, is when we exchange gases across the plasma membrane of a cell. So the process of ventilation is most heavily driven by the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscular division between thoracic and abdominal cavities. Thoracic cavity superior, abdominal or abdominal pelvic cavity inferior to that. We know that the diaphragm isn't just a straight shot of tissue across. It has quite a bit of shape or topography to it. It's probably best to conceptualize it as two hemidiaphragms, half of a diaphragm on each side. And that's because each side of the diaphragm is innervated by its own phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerves arise largely from the cervical plexus, a little bit from the brachial plexus, in that it has the spinal nerve roots of C3, 4, and 5. The mnemonic here is C3, 4, 5 keeps the diaphragm alive. So you have a right and a left phrenic nerve serving the right and left hemidiaphragm, which means that while these two will work in concert, if there's any sort of injury or interruption, only one hemidiaphragm will function at a time. As we see the diaphragm, we can note that it has a rather bimodal shape, with each hemidiaphragm having its own cupula. This is probably best viewed in a combination of this inferior view as well as the anterior view, but in the center of the diaphragm, we have something known as the central tendon. That's about there. That central tendon sits at about the level of the 8th thoracic vertebra, and that central tendon is fused to the pericardium. Within that central tendon is the caval hiatus, or the hole through which the inferior vena cava transverses the diaphragm up to the right atrium of the heart. Now, because the diaphragm is the major driver of ventilation, we need to think about what happens when that muscle contracts versus relaxes. When stimulated by the phrenic nerves, the hemidiaphragms are going to contract and pull the diaphragm inferiorly. When that happens, the thoracic volume is going to increase, and thus pressure decreases. When pressure decreases, air is going to want to follow the conductive pathway out into the lungs, and the lungs will expand accordingly. That's the process of inhalation. Now, relaxation is more of a passive process. So imagine that the diaphragm is contracted and then it begins to relax. When the diaphragm relaxes, then we have a decrease in volume. The decrease in volume increases pressure. When pressure increases, we'll have the movement of gas or air out of the lungs through the conductive pathway. That's known as exhalation. So just movement of the diaphragm alone is something that we call tidal breathing. Tidal volume is the amount of air in and out of the lungs, complements of the diaphragm. But we can do more than that. So we can employ accessory muscles. Accessory muscles of ventilation are those which can be recruited to change the volume and hence pressure of either the thoracic cavity or the abdominal pelvic cavity. And these may function for either forceful inhalation or forceful exhalation. Most of them are going to work upon the thoracic cavity by means of the ribs. So let's think about forceful inhalation. So there are external intercostal muscles. This is the externalmost layer of muscles between the ribs. And when external intercostal muscles contract, what they do is they lift the ribs outward and upward. So here's what I want you to do. Take your hands, right and left, and put them on your rib cage. And I want you to take a very deep breath in. You probably can feel your rib cage expanding outward. That's complements of your external intercostal muscles. They are pulling the ribs upward and outward, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, thereby decreasing pressure, thereby allowing for forceful inhalation. But those aren't the only muscles that we can help expand the thoracic cavity. So for instance, the sternocleidomastoid muscles can pull on the manubrium of the sternum to help slightly increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. The scalene muscles of the neck can pull on the first and second ribs to help elevate them, to help increase volume. Pec minor muscle can pull on the second, third, fourth ribs, expanding them upwards, helping to increase volume. Those are all accessory muscles of ventilation that affect inhalation. But we also have some that are involved in forceful exhalation. So internal intercostal muscles. So just deep to the external muscles, we have muscles that pull the ribs inward and downward, thus decreasing volume of the thoracic cavity, thus favoring exhalation. We also have abdominal muscles. So put a hand on your anterior abs and give a cough. You might feel your abdominal muscles engaging, and what that does is it puts force on the abdominal pelvic cavity. By putting force or pressure on the abdominal pelvic cavity, that puts pressure on the diaphragm. If you've ever had the wind knocked out of you, so someone's run at you with a full head of steam and they've knocked into you, that can forcefully put pressure on your thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. Or if anyone's ever given you a sucker punch in the gut, that Can be a sharp increase in pressure in the abdominal pelvic cavity that favors the movement of air out of the body. So let's assess our knowledge. Any muscles that increase the volume of the thoracic cavity will serve which process of ventilation? Is it exhalation or inhalation? Well, it's not exhalation, it is inhalation. So if we're talking about an increase of volume, that's going to be a decrease in pressure. And gases and air are always going to move from high pressure to low pressure. So that movement of air chasing the low pressure of the greater volume thoracic cavity is the hallmark of inhalation. So B is the correct answer. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you in the next video. Bye.